This is the On Humans podcast with your host, Ilari Mäkelä. Now, last September, I released a 3-part miniseries which explored the deep currents of Chinese history, not by listing emperors and dynasties, but by focusing on themes that shape the experiences and the worldviews of ordinary Chinese people. I absolutely loved doing the series, and I promised in the introduction then that I'd turn into other cultural areas in the future. Perhaps India, I said. So well, here we are. So why is India today so much poorer than the Western world or East Asian countries like China? And how did the Mughal emperors, the British imperialists, and Indian nationalists shape India's destiny? I'll be tackling these questions in 2 episodes. The second one will focus on the fate of independent India. But this first one goes back to some of the most debated topics in all of history. We'll travel all the way to Mughal Emperor Akbar around year 1600 and follow the story during the decline of the Mughals, the arrival of the British, and all the way to 1947 and that famous stroke of the midnight hour when India awoke to its life and freedom. Now, one thing is absolutely clear. During this period, India's position in the world economy collapsed. In 1600, India accounted for something between 25 and 30% of global GDP, and during the time of independence, that was something like 2%. But of course, you might say this is just a relative measure, comparing India to the global average. And it tells really very little about the experience of an average Indian. So our imperial historians like Neil Ferguson write that British railways and free trade helped Indian living standards, just much less than those of British or Japanese. Or are Indian nationalists like Shashi Thakur correct when they argue that British rule systematically destroyed Indians' once vibrant economy, doomed India to poverty, and made life more and more miserable for all Indians? Well, in December, I posted a question on social media asking for scholar recommendations, people who could tackle these issues with real data and not just ideology. And the post didn't actually gather much attention, but just a day later, I came across a new book announcement. The book was aptly titled An Economic History of India, and it covered India's history from 1600 till today, focusing on the living standards of ordinary people. And I couldn't have wished for a better book or a better guest, and so here we are. The author, Bishnupriya Gupta, is a professor of economics at the University of Warwick and one of the world's authorities on the history of Indian economy. And in this episode, we dive into all of the main topics surrounding this highly sensitive topic. We talk about railways, the Great Bengali Famine, but also much less known issues, such as the ways in which the education of Mahatma Gandhi might hold a clue to why India fell behind East Asian countries in the 20th century. I hope that you enjoy this. If you do, you can always show support by helping me grow the show, whether it's subscribing, leaving a 5-star review, sharing it on social media, sharing it to a friend. All of those things really do help. I also want to say thank you to all the wonderful group of people, as always, who support me at patreon.com/onhumans, chipping a small amount monthly and making my work significantly more sustainable and enjoyable. So thank you to all the Patreon supporters. And if you are considering joining, you can head to patreon.com/onhumans. But let's get the show started. So whoever you are, wherever you are, running errands, exercising, just wanting to learn more about human history, I appreciate your time, and I hope that you feel it's worth spending an hour with me and Bishnupriya Gupta. Professor Bishnupriya Gupta, welcome to On Humans.
Thank you for inviting me.
If you look at the history of India, say from 1600 to independence, what do you think would be the biggest questions that we should ask when thinking about the economic history of that period?
So, coming from India and very much growing up with colonialism in mind, the first question I had in mind when I started my research over my career was, to what extent was colonialism responsible for India's economic development, in more recent times? And of course, you start with 1950 when you can see the data and you see that India was really one of the poorest countries in the world. So that's what I started with, that I want to understand why it was poor. Is it colonization or is it something else, just natural resources that, the population had access to?
And I think this ties into the so-called Great Divergence debate. Why don't we actually, maybe you could explain briefly what is the topic of Great Divergence and how that ties and links into your work?
The Great Divergence is this European success or economic success where Europe in general, but more particularly Britain and the Netherlands, how did they get so much ahead of countries such as India? Or even China, which was never a formal colony, but faced lots of different kinds of European interventions. And that's a debate that has been um, a mainstream of economic history since the publication of Ken Pomerantz's very well-known book on the Great Divergence. And the question was that, how did Europe get to where it was by, let's say, end of the 19th century compared to the Asian countries? Pomerantz answered this question saying, um, if you compare the most developed parts of Britain with the most developed parts of China, there was not that much of a difference in 1800. And he tried to talk about Britain's access to natural resources such as coal, which was useful for the Industrial Revolution, as well as colonization. So this book led to a whole bunch of papers where people started putting together data, because Ken Pomerantz's book is path breaking, but the data in that book was more limited. So people started gathering wages and prices and all this type of data to see where exactly Britain was relative to India and China. And that's when I began this work with Steve Broadbury, who's at Oxford. At that time, he was at Warwick. So we were colleagues, and we started putting the data together on wages in India.
Yeah, I think that for me, on a bit of like my personal story, I read Pomerantz's book as part of my master's in Beijing, and that was the first time when I got really interested in economic history, and it was because of this way in which, even with the limited data, he really tries to understand what was life like for the people, not what was the fanciest corporation like.
Exactly.
Or it was really history of the people. And later on, when I started seeing these numbers on wages going back hundreds and hundreds of years, of how much food could the average blacksmith in London buy in 1600, and how much could the average weaver in Bengal buy in 1700s, that really touched me, almost in a sense that this was the kind of history I had always wanted. This was history of real people, of everyday life. But you've been at the very forefront of that, so let's go straight to it. What Pomerantz, he doesn't really talk much about India. He's a China scholar himself, but he thinks that this is the Great Divergence is a late divergence. So it's only very recently in the big picture that the English and the Dutch start pulling ahead. What does the data that you have gathered say to this question?
Okay, so before I talk about our data, I just want to mention there's work by Prasannan Parthasarathi in Boston College, where he looked at the living standards of the weavers in England and the weavers in southern India. And he came up with this argument that, they were equally well off.
Around what time?
Around the middle of the 18th century.
Okay, so this was like the dawn of British imperialism in India.
Exactly. And very similar to the picture Ken Pomerantz painted. Our data, we could go back to 1595 or 1600, which is when Akbar had this volume of economic data published by one of his ministers on all kinds of aspects of the Mughal economy. So from there, we have lots of information. So we went back to that. We collected wages, and then we collected wages of the intervening period. So from 1595 all the way to 1900, the wage data comes from, there are hundreds and hundreds of observations, not from the same place. They're all over India in different places. So two things we had. One was the data on wages a person earned, the money wages. The other one was the price of the main grain they consumed. And the idea was that the grain wage would be kind of a good proxy for what we call real wages today.
Basically, how much wheat or rice can you buy with a day's work?
Exactly. So we did two categories of wages, of skilled workers and unskilled workers in northern and southern India. And then we kind of divided it by the price of the grain they consumed and got the real wage. And here you can see in 1600, the difference in real wages was not that much. Indian wages and Britain, and the Indian wages were something like, close to 80% of British wages in many instances. And then if you kind of make a comparison over time, you'll see a pattern that emerged is a decline in the wages. So this is not the colonial period. Well before colonization, the wages in India began to decline. And there could be a variety of reasons. It could be there were wars, so prices rose. It could be that cultivation moved into poor quality land, and therefore, what they were producing was not that productive. All these reasons meant that Indian incomes had begun to decline from the middle of the 17th century. So by the time there was colonization of India in the 18th century, Indian incomes were already lower at a time when British incomes were rising.
And it wasn't only that they were lower, they had already been a bit lower, you say maybe 80%, but they were stagnating, even declining, whilst the British wages were increasing, is what you're saying.
Exactly. And the main period of decline which we noticed from the wages is really between the middle of the 17th century to the beginning of the 19th century. And then they kind of flatten out in the 19th century. So it's from this data, it was hard to see that it's colonization which caused the wages to decline, because the decline had started earlier. We then went on to do the same kind of estimates of GDP per capita. And that's because, the wages we had, they're all kind of urban workers.
Yes, and most of the people are farmers.
Exactly. Most of the Indian population was in farming, and they were living in the countryside. So the GDP estimates which we did um, later on support the declining trend, but they kind of make it a little different. So the Indian GDP per capita in 1600 was 60% of the British GDP per capita in that year. And these are all comparable numbers because they're in these purchasing power parity controls.
Yeah, like how much can you actually buy stuff?
Exactly. So they're like this GK dollars in 1990, and we see the decline paralleling almost the decline in wages. So I think we were quite confident that the decline started before 1800, which is the 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 point which Pomeranz talked about. And we had a very friendly kind of debate with him, and I think his position may have changed a little bit, but I think everybody agrees that the 19th century was bad for almost all of Asia. But the main question was, when did it start? And in our series, the decline started much earlier.
And so before the listeners think we're completely letting the British Empire off the hook, I can leave a little hang on. We will get back to that, but there's already stagnation before the British arrived. They're starting from a relatively similar position around 1600 is what you're saying. Two questions on that. One is, you already mentioned that there's a couple of reasons which might explain this. Can you say anything more about that? I mean, for example, could there be was there a lot of population growth which would then lead into more pressure on land, and then there weren't good tools to make more of the land? I mean, do we have any clue on why? Because this seems to be the question. Why was India stagnating already at that time?
So there are several arguments about this. One is that there were wars. So the 18th century is full of conflicts, which affected, production in many parts of India. So that could be one factor. The other factor could be that, all the fertile land was now already cultivated, and therefore agricultural productivity was bound to decline. And as people started cultivating more and more of marginal land, it began to decline even more. So these to me are the two main explanations. Population growth was very, very low at this time, and because of the frequency of famines which wiped out large shares of the population growth was not high until, sort of very much late into the 19th century.
Interesting.
And therefore, I don't see that as being an explanation.
Well, the second question that I have is that there is a way, which I think is by far the most meaningful thing, which is to ask how much bread, how much rice, how much cloth can these people buy in India and in England? When you look at, for example, the food prices and the wages, it looks like these are two pretty similar worlds. But there is a very interesting thing, which is that the English are earning much, much more in terms of silver. So bread is more. So it's a little bit like today, in some sense. Bread is more expensive in London than in Mumbai. The wages are also higher. Nowadays, of course, you can also buy more bread on the average salary in London than Mumbai. Back then, you couldn't, but the silver wages are higher. And that means that the English have more capacity to, I don't know, buy stuff from China, buy stuff from the international market. Can you say a little bit more of why do you think that there is this kind of, you get a very different picture when you look at the silver wages? I can't remember the percentages, but it was something like 20-30% of the British wages in terms of silver. So why? Uh, what explains that, and what does that kind of mean for the economy? Could that be like one of the reasons why the English are able to start having growth in their wages, that they're more able to become traders, and because there's more kind of extra cash, any little bit of the English salary that is being saved can buy more of goods from the world market? So is that kind of part of the picture? So yeah, the reasons and the consequences of this very low silver wage in India.
So, if you look at countries today and look at how much people are earning, the wages in India are much lower than the wages in Britain, for example. But when you then try to do purchasing power parity comparisons, um, and looking at cost of food and other consumer goods, this difference kind of becomes smaller, right? The purchasing power adjusted wages are always slightly closer than the nominal wages. So the fact that wages were high in England is a symptom or a kind of outcome that this economy was already quite developed. It was much more commercial, and therefore wages were high because of high productivity of certain sectors. And so the difference between high nominal wages and low nominal wages also captures this difference in their productivity levels.
Yeah, the nominal wages being like the silver, how many grams of silver you get, not the real wage of how much bread can you buy with it. Yeah, and just like in today,
Exactly.
because you have these differences, there's much more. The Brits have much more purchasing power in the kind of buying international goods. But doesn't that suggest that that it isn't even true that the difference starts around 1600? In some sense, that to me suggests that the difference must have started even earlier, because if you look at how much bread the weavers can buy, yeah, okay, it starts to diverge around 1600. But if you look at this kind of how much money do they actually have to buy world products in terms of grams of silver, it starts much earlier. So what is that? Is that the influx of, I don't know, Spanish silver in Europe from the colonies? Is that something wonderful about the post Black Death British early mercantile revolution? I mean, there's so many stories that could explain that. Do you have your favorite story on why? What had led into that divergence in silver wages that early?
So my favorite story, if I do have one, is there's a paper by uh, Joachim Voth and Nico Weitlander. Uh, it's called Three Horsemen of Riches, and they think of all economies as being Malthusian.
For listeners, Malthusian meaning that the more you get money, the more you can afford to have kids, which soon means that you have more people, not more prosperous people, unfortunately. Yeah.
Exactly. So you always stay at subsistence. So the Black Death increased wages by wiping out population. So over time, you would expect there to be population growth that would then make wages lower, and then everybody goes back to subsistence. What happened in Britain, because it was a much more urbanized economy, the mortality in the urban centers was a lot higher because of bad sanitations, etc. It was also because of wars. Britain was always at war with different European countries. that wiped out some population. Disease environment in the cities was bad, so that wiped out some population. So all these things led to population growth slowing down in England. So England never actually went back to its subsistence level. And that kind of put it in an advantageous position vis-a-vis many other countries. So in that sense, I like that story a lot. Their paper kind of offers some empirical evidence to it. So I think there is now the new estimates done by Steve Broadberry and co-authors, which is of taking England back to 1300. And they already find that England was somewhat more developed than other countries for all these reasons. It was a much more urban economy. It had much more commercialization.
And it's interesting that this commercialization doesn't necessarily lead the British people to be healthier or wealthier in certain regards, but it does mean that if they can save a little bit of their salaries, they have more purchasing power on the international market.
Exactly. I'm not an expert on this, so I don't want to say too much, but there is, I think, a lot of evidence that England was at a different place. And Bob Allen's work on this high wage economy being a condition for technological change. So when you have high wages, you want to substitute labor by capital.
The more silver you have to put into each person working at to make cloth, the more you want to have a machine making it instead. So that's the Bob Allen thesis.
Exactly. So that also makes sense. And that also seems like a good way to think of the Industrial Revolution in Britain.
Well, that's interesting about Britain, but let's return to India. So the big picture is that India, okay, there is this interesting change already that there's less silver, it's less commercialized. So there's small differences, but the big picture is relatively similar in terms of the average living standards around 1600. And India doesn't only stagnate, it actually plummets and then stagnates. And according to data in your book, the average Indian around the time of the independence was either similarly or actually probably worse off than they were during the reign of Akbar in the late 1500s, which is a really remarkable stagnation. I don't think it's necessarily as remarkable as many of us think in world historic terms. I think it seems to be the norm the more I read economic history, that there is stagnation is almost the norm. But there was this huge stagnation. And so let's now look then at what happens when the British East India Company starts taking over around mid 1700s, and then later in the mid 1800s, the British Crown takes over. One of the major kind of questions around this era is, there are of course those who say that the British were great for the Indian economy. I don't think there's much numbers to support that. But then one of the claims here, one of the really big questions is, how much did India just kind of stagnate? How much did they just stay where they were? Versus how much did the British actively destroy the Indian economy, hinder Indian growth? And this is one topic which comes up a lot in online discussions, for example, is the way in which the British deindustrialized India. So there was a lot of cloth making in various parts of India. And this was completely, some say it was destroyed by the competition from the British Industrial Revolution. But some people say there was active machine breaking. There was definitely very well recorded policy in England against Indian cloth. So before the great free markets of the British Empire, there was a lot of great tariffs on Indian textiles to protect the British industry against this Indian cloth. So why don't you, with that little intro, why don't you kind of talk us through, having studied the actual numbers around what happens, how much did Britain deindustrialize India, and how much did that shape the kind of big picture of the Indian economy?
Okay, so all the European trading companies came to India in search of spices, but they found textiles which were exquisite and beautiful, and they were in different types of qualities. So in the European market, there was high demand for cotton cloth, because remember that this was much more comfortable than wool, wearing wool next to the skin. And the demand for cotton calicos and muslin, which is the kind of high quality textiles was very high. So the East India Company, not just the English company, but also the Dutch, the French, the Portuguese, this is what they wanted to buy and sell in Europe. The way they did it is quite interesting. So this is, before East India Company became the ruler. This is going back to the 17th century. The way they did it was they came to India, they would contract with the weavers through an intermediary to supply a certain types of cloth in certain quantities of certain designs. And they would come back 8 months later to to take possession of what they had ordered. But when they ordered, they also made an advance to cover the raw material cost and the cost of food and everything for the weavers, because they needed subsistence.
Okay, so they kind of prepay for the cloth.
They prepaid for a lot of the cloth. There was an advance, and then they would come and collect it. Quite often, they would come and say, "This is not what we ordered. We had asked for something else." And the contracts, I've seen many of these contracts, had some penalties in them. But it was always difficult to penalize the weavers, because the main purpose of the companies was to get cloth and sell it and make a profit. So that was their objective. So they didn't want to get rid of the weavers, so that this is what they wanted. So the Indian textile exports began to rise dramatically from the late 17th century. And they rose dramatically in the 18th century, and everywhere in Europe it was sold. And you mentioned the response of the weavers in Britain. There was a lot of protest. The British government banned the import of printed calico for the British market. They could only buy white cloth and print on them, and then sell it in the British market.
Oh, interesting. So that would keep some jobs in England, because at least you can have the coloring done in England.
Exactly. So there were lots of these calico acts, banned imports of various types of calico into England, which allowed the English weavers to become good at some things, or have a share of the market. So the way Steve Broadberry and I thought about this is to think of this as an import substituting industry in Britain. They were importing Indian cloth, and this, with tariffs, then they tried to develop within Britain. And you can then think of the Industrial Revolution and the technological change, which allowed them to do this, because they couldn't just import Indian technology, given that British wages were so high. Indian technology was very simple. It was very labor intensive. It was not a technology which was suitable for Britain. So we see the Industrial Revolution as a response to this demand for textiles. And it's only in the 19th century that you see a big decline in this textiles.
In India.
In India, the textile production in India.
So in the 1800s, 19th century, you see the reduction of the Indian.
Exactly.
You see the deindustrialization.
You see the deindustrialization. Now, you can think of it as being forced by the East India Company, because they were still the rulers. That argument, is somewhat problematic, because East India Company wanted to buy textile to make profit in the European market. So for them, destroying the Indian industry didn't make any sense. What they did, once they got control of Bengal, once they became rulers of Bengal, was to then use the revenue from land to pay for these textiles, rather than getting silver or bullion from Europe to pay the weavers. So their task of acquiring textiles became a lot easier than if they were going to, bring bullion and pay for wages, pay for the cloth.
And this might have been a problem for India, right? Because then the Indian economy has even less silver.
Exactly. So that is a drain from India. You can think of that as a drain from India. which is just taking your own revenue to pay for the textiles.
So you're kind of closing India off from the world market in some sense.
Exactly. And the East India Company, therefore, I don't see them as having an incentive to destroy the weaving or the textile industry. The way we think of it is that faced with the competition from the goods of the Industrial Revolution, which were a lot cheaper by the early 19th century, the Indian products could no longer stand this competition. So think of the shock which is known as the China shock in Europe and North America, that these cheap goods from China started coming, and the industries which are European began to become uncompetitive. It's a very similar thing. In the Chinese case, it's low wages which gave them the advantage. In the Indian textile industry, the wages were low. The main competition came from the superior technology of the Industrial Revolution, which made producing thread very efficient, much faster, and much cheaper. So the first group of people who started to buy British thread or yarn were the Indian weavers. They were the first people to switch to the imported yarn.
Interesting.
And the Indian consumers also started buying this cheaper cloth. So if you look at per capita consumption of cloth, during the 19th century, it began to rise because it was cheaper to buy cloth. They could buy more of it. So we see the decline of the Indian textile industry as a response to this new product made with a new technology coming in and making the local products uncompetitive, or local industries uncompetitive. If you look at what had happened to Indian technology in textiles over time, very little had changed. What had changed was the design, the color, and that kind of stuff. But the machine itself hadn't changed much. Whereas when you look at the Industrial Revolution, you see the spinning jenny, then you see a new jenny, and then you see something else. It was a continuous process of technological change.
But how important do you think that being subjugated, being part, being not a self-governing entity, how much do you think that this accelerated the problem and or prevented India from having some kind of a response, like, for example, imposing tariffs? The English were able to first impose tariffs on the Indian cloth and then later reduce tariffs and have the wonderful free trade when it suited them. How much do you think that India would have been in a better position to respond to this shock if they would not have been a colony?
So that's a very good point. India did not have autonomy on its own destiny, and therefore the British could just do whatever they wanted. But I want to think of the counterfactual scenario, right? So let's say there could be two types of tariffs. One is just to ban all imports. That's possible. Then the consumers may have lost out because they actually gained from the cheaper cloth, right? The second way to think of it is, okay, have a tariff. That tariff would have to be at least 150% to break even with the British prices. So, in terms of the effect on the economy, not just by looking at this sector, but consumers, other sectors, etc., it's not very clear that a tariff policy would have solved the problem. It would have certainly delayed it. And there's work by Indrajit Ray from India, which shows exactly this, that, tariff was no longer a viable policy to completely stop the British goods coming in. It would have just delayed the process a bit, but wouldn't have changed anything significantly.
What would it have taken for India to early? Because I think one question people have is that, well, why didn't the Indian then just use machines? Why didn't they import machines from Britain? Well, they did at some point to some extent. It's not true that they never did, but they started late, right? It was never on a massive scale. What were the conditions that prevented the Indian entrepreneurs from copying the model and they had the advantage that, for example, China has now, which is the lower wages. So if they could have imported British machinery in bigger quantities and used cheaper labor, that would have been great for them. Do you think, how much was that something that there was an inherent problem with that strategy, or how much was it that it suited the British in general to prevent India from doing that, so they never allowed it or made it possible?
So there are two issues here. One is that, remember that Britain didn't allow export of machinery, textile machinery, until the middle of the 19th century.
Oh, they actively did not allow that.
Exactly.
Interesting.
And a lot
Oh,
of
I
the
see. I did not know that.
technology that went to the US was taken by the artisans or the workers themselves, or kind of smuggled in, whereas
Oh, interesting.
it's only from the middle of the 19th century that there was export of British machinery to everywhere in the world, and the Indian entrepreneurs did respond. So I'm just going to digress a little bit to say that the alternative story that you can think of is, you know, why didn't the Indians develop their own technology? And I think, given the cheap labor costs and the share of capital and labor being very much in favor of labor, so there were many more workers than capital in the economy in the 18th century and 19th century. It wasn't seen as the way forward or something beneficial to develop new technology. So when the new technology in Britain began to develop, initially there was not much, and exports were allowed. There was not much of a movement. It was only when the Indian traders, who made a lot of wealth in cotton trade during the American Civil War, decided to move into textile production. And this was kind of 1860s onwards. That's when they began to import British machinery into India and set up the modern textile firms. And these were extremely successful. They were all set up by Indian entrepreneurs.
Do you remember right that these were mainly in the western parts like Gujarat?
It was mainly in Bombay Presidency, which is Maharashtra and Gujarat today. And a lot of this was initially in Mumbai, set up by the Parsis, but also by the Gujarati Banyas, who were traders and had a lot of wealth. There were other groups involved, such as the Muslim traders, who were wealthy and set up these cotton textile farms. There were also the Baghdadi Jews who had come to India. They were very active in this trade, and they set up some firms. So if we think of the period of deindustrialization, when the Indian market moved from being completely dominated by Indian textiles to British textiles, that period is between 1850 and 1880, so 30 years.
Oh, so it's a very short period in the big
It's
picture.
a very short. Then the market share began to change, and Indian modern industries began to enter this market. So lots of the weavers who lost their jobs, their situation was terrible. And Bengal, which was the main production center at this time, saw a big decline in industrial workers, and they all kind of moved back into agriculture. But if you look at how many workers were in industry, that estimate is not more than 10%. So the economy was not an industrial economy. The Indian economy, wherever it was, textile production or not, was an agricultural economy. So what happened in the industrial sector, in the textile production, had very sharp impact on the local population in Bengal, and also elsewhere where there were weavers, mainly in Bengal. But it didn't have a massive effect on the economy as a whole.
I think that's really interesting. I've kept thinking about that point since reading your book. I mean, it reminds me, for example, of China today, where with DeepSeek, anyone who looks at China today, they might look, oh,
Yeah.
they have this wonderful edge in AI, but that doesn't mean the Chinese economy is doing particularly well now than it was, because that's still such a small part of the economy. And India, in a sense, was perhaps, it might be a mistake to focus on the most kind of a flashy high class thing like cloth making, and see that determines the fate of the economy. Whereas in Indian case, in historical India, it was overwhelmingly what happened for the farmers was what happened to the average Indian. And I think that's a really interesting point. And the other thing that you said is that the deindustrialization was actually quite a short period. Well, that's also then quite clear that that cannot in itself explain this whole long stagnation in Indian living standards and the fact that people weren't better off during early independence than they were during Emperor Akbar. So what does explain it? I mean, we did talk a little bit about the pre-British, somewhat of a mystery, but you gave some possible explanations for why India was stagnating, first plummeting and then stagnating. During the British period, what happened to, not to the weavers, not to this part, which of course individual tragedies, but you say they're a small part of the big picture. The big picture is agriculture. What happened to agriculture during the reign of the East India Company and then during the British Raj?
So the way I see of policy failure by the colonial government, and to me, that's the main adverse effect of British rule of India, is one is its policy towards agriculture, and the second thing is its policy towards education. So let's just focus for now on agriculture. So India was, as a country, is very dependent, or at least had been historically very dependent on the monsoon rains. So it has these rain abundant regions where rice is grown, and also the drier regions where wheat or other kind of crops such as millet are grown. So because of this dependence on rainfall, it can often happen that a rainfall failure leads to famines, or a flood can displace a lot of people, and then there's a crisis. So tackling this would have been, or should have been, the main goal of a government that rules this country, whichever government, whether it's the Mughals or the British. So something to be said for the Mughals is that they stopped ruling India in the middle of the 19th century.
Well, but hold on a second. I mean, the last emperor is in the 19th century, but a lot of the de facto actual ruling power, they had lost it to the British East India Company
Yes.
way earlier, right?
No, absolutely. You're absolutely right. But if you think of the technology of the 19th century is totally different from the technology of the 18th century. So what the Mughals, if they had full control of India, what they might have done is a counterfactual question, which I don't have an answer to that. Whether they would have been better equipped to provide irrigation, or experimental stations where you develop new types of seeds which are resistant to drought. The British did have these facilities, but most often they were targeting products such as raw cotton, which was exported. So a lot of the British interventions were targeted towards the export sector
Oh, like cotton rather than like wheat and rice.
rather than rice. And what to
Mm-hmm.
me was a shocking piece of data is that if you look at rice productivity in the rice growing areas, which are the rain abundant areas, this is negative from 1900. So if you compare 1600 to somewhere end of 19th century or end of British rule, the output per acre was higher in 1600 in all types of agricultural products.
So the Indian rice productivity had actually decreased since the reign of
Exactly.
Akbar
Exactly.
during their and this was partially during the British rule.
And then you ask yourself the question that what was going on there? And it's just that there was no investment in agricultural technology. And this is from a colonizer, which which not only had the Industrial Revolution, but before the Industrial Revolution, there was an agricultural revolution in Britain, which had changed the agricultural technology and productivity completely. There was some irrigation in the dry parts of the country, such as Punjab and Haryana and Sindh, where the British built these canals to have irrigation. And these were the successful agricultural areas. Like if you look at the data today, uh, from Kurosaki's work, you'll see that, the Pakistani side of India had much higher productivity because of these colonies. And you don't see that at all in the eastern part of the countries.
So where the British did decide to invest in irrigation, it did help, but you say that they didn't do it nearly to the extent that they could have and they should have.
Exactly. So where they did invest in irrigation, there were results, but they didn't do it enough.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. That kind of gives me the image that this gives is not the British being these, well, obviously not these kind of, I don't know, great civilizers as some people might have wanted, but neither are ruthless, I mean, economically ruthless destroyers, but rather just quite incapable and quite kind of lame almost as economic
Absolutely.
rulers, is that they just, don't achieve really anything.
No, I mean,
Um,
absolutely. I totally agree. Like they didn't care about the living standards of the average population. They did not think about growth in the economy. Of course, they worked in self-interest. I mean, I don't have the slightest doubt that this is true. But there are also instances of social reformers, particular individuals asking for, support to the Indians. So there are many British individuals who came to India, tried to implement policies of certain types, which were um, helpful for the Indian population. But the policy in London and in wherever the capital was in India, Calcutta or Delhi, was not to think of the well-being of the Indian population. It was never that. And I don't have any doubts about it. I think the debate, uh, if there are any, is mainly about what was the factor that led to this decline. Is it deindustrialization or is it agriculture? And my vote is on the side of agriculture.
yeah, but briefly before we move to education, which you mentioned as another policy failure, um, what about the famines? I mean, for example, I mean the British rule in Bengal is bookended by some of the worst famines in Bengal's history that we have records of in 1770 and then during the Second World War. And in both cases, it doesn't seem to be, I mean, kind of to contradict myself from earlier, this doesn't seem to be a kind of, well, they just didn't have the right policies. There was a very active um, attempt by Churchill to divert grain away from Bengal during the famine in this later famine, and in the 1770 famine, based on my relatively shallow reading of it, but it really does seem like the East India Company was like, well, oh, there's a famine, well, let's just keep taxing them at a higher rate to keep getting the same amount. So how much do you think that these are kind of individual dark episodes within a more a picture which is mostly just kind of stagnation and kind of lack of proper irrigation and whatnot? Or how much do you think that those are symbols of the kind of day-to-day reality of the British Empire, not just not investing enough in irrigation, but actively having taxation and other kind of ways designed so that they were just actively preventing India from, keeping any surplus that they could have produced for themselves?
So this is a very important question. So the first kind of major famine after um, East India Company becoming the ruler of Bengal is the Bengal famine of the late 18th century, where 1/3 of the Bengal population seems to have been killed,
Yeah, which is a remarkable
which is a remarkable
1/3.
number. And there, all these things that you mentioned, that not reducing the tax burden, not being bothered, I mean, all these are, all valid concerns and valid and true to a large extent. Then you come to the 19th century, end of the 19th century, when there were, the railways were being built, right? So this is another kind of controversial topic in Indian economic history.
Oh yeah, we can't talk about the imperial economy without mentioning the railways.
Exactly.
Yes.
So they are also connected to the famines, because let's think of it this way. When the first railway lines were built, they did connect the ports to the hinterland to make import and export easier.
which is often used as a very reasonable counter argument to the kind of, oh, the British brought the railways, oh, look how wonderful is that. Well, hold on a second, look, why did they do it? They did it to make it cheaper for them to bring raw materials out of India, ship them to England to feed the Industrial Revolution. Not exactly a humanitarian cause.
Exactly, absolutely right. But so if I look at the railway network in 1870, that's the picture you would get. But as you move over time, in 1910, you'll see the railway network quite dense. And it not only connected the ports to the interior, but also connected the interior. So these had two effects. One is that, suppose there's a famine, you could ship grain from a place of plenty to a place of disaster very quickly. And, bullock carts were very slow. Boats were very slow, whereas the railways were fast. So there is now enough evidence to show that the railways did mitigate the effect of harvest failures much more quickly. There is also much older work by John Hurd, where he shows that the price difference across markets became much lower because of the railways.
Because you could ship the rice from where there's too much to where there's too little.
Exactly.
So certain kind of free market optimists would see a glimmer of hope, not in the early phase of railways, but in the late stage of railways during the British Empire.
Absolutely. And
interesting.
There was also a lot of discussion within the Famine Commission, late 19th century, saying there was a commission the British government in India set up. It's called the Famine Commission. They took a lot of evidence from all kinds of people, and they talked about building irrigation canals to mitigate, to mitigate the rainfall disasters. They also suggested many things. It's not that everything was charitable. One concern they had was, suppose there's a famine, we have to put in a lot of resources to then do stuff for the people there. So let's just do something where we don't, it's not they're being benevolent. It's also,
but I mean, it is better than actively, I don't know, causing a famine. For
no,
sure.
absolutely, I totally agree. But the main kind of example of total policy failure, and in fact, actively kind of not doing anything, is Churchill's response to the famine of Bengal. Like, there are discussions on, was there a harvest failure? Was there not a harvest failure? And I think that doesn't matter, because even if there was a harvest failure, you could have moved grain from other places to Bengal rather than shipping them off somewhere else.
Because you had the wonderful railways.
Exactly. So,
so if you're so big of a fan of the railways,
precisely.
You should actually then use them instead. Yeah, and we have some pretty outrageous comments from Churchill written down on policy documents, official documents,
absolutely,
where he makes it very clear that he doesn't give a damn about what's happening in Bengal. But would you say then that this kind of Churchill famine, if we may call it that, was perhaps less symbolic of the general late British rule? That was more like the darkest hour of the late British rule, rather than a kind of symbol of agricultural policy during the late British rule, that there were also certain kind of lame but positive developments at the same time.
So I definitely see the from the late 19th century, that famines were much less frequent because of the railways. You could say that this was not an intention of the policy to control famines or to reduce famine, but it was a byproduct of the railway policy, that it had lots of different impacts on the economy. And one was that the incidence of famines, the frequency of famines, it's not that there were no famines, but they became less frequent than they had been before. And that makes the Bengal famine of 1942 even more outrageous. So, I have no doubt in my mind that this was something the British government should be ashamed of.
Well, before we end the discussion on the colonial era and discuss independence, you mentioned education. I think this is something that's going to become really central to the discussion in the second half, where we do talk about the kind of long-term impacts of colonial policy. But very briefly, what did you mean? What did you have in mind earlier when you said that you see two policy failures? One, agriculture, we've discussed it, and the other one, education. What was the policy failure in terms of education?
If you look at India going back to the 19th century, there was a lot of discussion on how education should develop in the country. There were Indians who kind of wanted a Western style education based on science and modern methods.
Do what Japanese did to some extent, I guess.
Absolutely. And they wanted, kind of national curriculum rather than religious curricula, which was there in, all parts of the country. And that kind of was coming from a variety of different people, social reformers, Indian social reformers, political thinkers, but also from the British government, which wanted to develop a civil service, which could be eventually be in the hands of the Indians. So they wanted to get a group of English-speaking, highly literate Indians who could be absorbed in the civil service.
A middle management of the empire.
Exactly. And you see these universities develop India had main universities developing in the cities of Calcutta, Delhi, Madras, Mumbai, going back to the 19th century.
And of course, Gandhi would be the perfect symbol of this kind of very well educated in Britain even, person who is very literate in kind of both English and Indian culture, and who the British first were very happy and proud about, that we have these people who can serve as the middle management.
Absolutely.
And then it turned out a little bit different towards the end.
Exactly.
And this is a little bit different, am I right, to African colonies? Am I right that in India, more than in African colonies, the Indian elite had more place in the British Empire, both politically and economically, than the African elites within African colonies?
From the data, that's how it seems. I don't know, I hesitate to speak on Africa in a very kind of authoritative way, but that's the impression I have from the data. I did say in the book is that when you look at who were the elites in India, you have a lot of Indians amongst the elite. So this comes from the income tax data, which is a very urban, it's an urban data set. So how many people paid income taxes was restricted to the the urban Indians. And if you look at who were the richest 0.1% of the population, or who were the rich, who were 0.1% of the population, there were, of course, many British people there, but there were also a large number of Indians there. These were the Tata, the Parsis, who were extremely wealthy. But not just the Parsis, all the other trading groups. They were amongst Mumbai in particular, the Bombay presidency had a lot of Indians as wealthy people.
And okay, so this was it was more the economic elites that you were discussing in your book. Fair enough.
Yes.
But I guess let's leave that Africa comparison aside and stick to the main point, because so far everything you've said is suggesting of British putting money into educating these future Gandhis and whatnot. And that's true, but there is a big but. So why don't we go to the but?
Yeah. So the big but is, ultimately, we have to look at the literacy numbers, right? How many people benefited from this system? So when we look at literacy rate at the time of independence, it's 17% of the population. So however literate some Indians were, and in how many high professions they were present, doesn't really matter, because the average Indian was still not educated. And this, I think, is a huge failure of a colonizer, where primary education became compulsory. There was a move towards making primary education universal and then compulsory. So, it's not that these things were not going on in Britain, but it never got transported to the colonies, that let's give primary education to everyone.
And you have really striking numbers on how at some point, I can't remember exactly when, but at some point in time, the amount of people in high schools and universities in India was similar to like France, but the amount of people in primary education was much lower than Brazil. So that
Exactly.
there was like this huge skew towards putting almost, and still today, India is an outlier in how much money it invests in high schools and universities compared to primary education. Am I right?
No, absolutely. So this I again see a colonial legacy, which we haven't done much to correct. And, it's also been a strength in many ways, and probably we'll talk about it later on. But it is a policy that didn't benefit many people.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, before we finish this part, there is a way in which the agricultural story, the deindustrialization story, and education story that we have discussed might be part of a mega story. So let me try to make that. This actually comes from a previous guest of mine, Oded Galore.
Uh-huh.
And Galore, I think if he was here, he would say that these are all part of the same story, because the way he sees, and the way he explained this to me, was that what happens in India during the 1800s is that Britain starts to use India as the supplier of raw materials, of the cotton itself for the British machines. Well, what that does is that when you put a country on a path where how you get rich is by producing, say, cloth, you put a country on a path where it doesn't make sense to educate the population. You need to be purely benevolent to want to educate your farmers. Whereas if you're industrial, you have a business incentive to increase literacy and increase numeracy, because the machines they're not quite as easy to operate as people might think. You need these kind of basic education skills to work, especially later on when the machines get more complicated. And what happens is that the deindustrialization of India and forcing India into being purely agricultural in a sense is okay. Maybe you don't see it big in the GDP numbers, but you do see it in that it really locks India on this kind of old agricultural path where primary education doesn't make economic sense. And then and he has a kind of additional flip to this, which is that he sees education as the reason for families to start having less children. Is when you have to educate them, it's much better to have fewer children and invest a bit more in them, rather than have plenty of children who can all help you on the farm. And therefore, he would say, the Indian population has been growing during the century or so that the British economy, GDP per capita, has been growing. More people in India, more prosperous people in Britain. So why don't we wrap up with your reflections on this kind of mega narrative on tying all these different bits together? How plausible do you think that is? How much does it capture of what's actually going on, and how much is it just one big story amongst many other possible big stories?
So I totally agree that, if you look at private incentives, if you're in an agricultural society, you don't have any incentive to educate your children. And I know that comes from the work of Oded Galore and Omar Moav, who's my colleague. Um, but you have to also look at the evidence today from India that the uptake of the Green Revolution is more if there is education in the households, that people are better able to adopt technology or access information if they have more education. Now, of course, if the private individuals do not have the incentive to do it, you need the government to become the uh, policymaker to say, no, we want to have universal primary education, because in the long run, this would benefit society, because we know human capital is good for growth. So if the private incentive is not there, it's for the government to be even more proactive. And that's why I think the British failure is that much more serious, that they were not concerned, and they wanted to just do their own something which benefited them by developing an extremely literate Indian elite, which would help them to rule the country. And you mentioned Gandhi. There's Nehru. There is Raja Rammohn Rao. Like, all these Indians are extremely educated in Western education. Many of them travel to England to get educated. So we did have that group of people. But we never developed this for everyone. And I think that's where the government had to come in and did not, because education in every country, primary education in every country, has been spread by government interventions, compulsory schooling, banning child labor, all those things. And none of these things happened. What did happen is every time a law, factory law labor law was passed in Britain, Lancashire lobbied to get that passed in India in case the Indian industries got some advantage by not
Oh, I see.
having child labor laws or that kind of thing. So that
Okay.
happened almost instantaneously. But the education changes in the laws of how to give primary education were never transferred to India.
And what's really interesting in your book is you make the point that you might not expect the colonial power to do anything like that, but it's not impossible because Japan did promote primary education in, for example, Taiwan and South Korea during their imperial adventures there. And that did give these countries an advantage later on, which is a topic that we'll cover more in the second part, talking about independence era. But thank you so much, Professor Gupta. This has been a wonderful tour of a very difficult and complicated topic, and I really appreciate your input.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So that was it for today. Thanks for sticking with us until the very end. If you want more, definitely stay tuned to the next episode. And if you want to go to the archive, you can check the What About China miniseries, starting at episode 44, and the Birth of Modern Prosperity miniseries with a really all-star lineup of guests, including Nobel Prize winner Daron Acemoglu. You'll find it after episode 40. So there's a lot there. Do check it out, do subscribe, and if you're a long-term listener, do consider heading to patreon.com/onhumans and pledge your small monthly support. Thank you for considering. Until next time, take care.